I'm here today. This is not the book we looked at earlier. This is the other Hopper book that I said I might look at for comparison. Because this is what I thought the other one would be like. Also, just due to the nature of the theme, as you can see, this is a book on his landscapes, and so the other one had a city theme to it, and so I thought, what I was getting in for was this book, except for about cities. There's a list of the Foundation Baylor would like to extend its greatest thanks to all the lenders for their contribution to the success of the exhibition. First and foremost, we thank the Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, for its significant support. The exhibition is organized by the Foundation Baylor in cooperation with the Whitney, the major repository of Hopper's work. Ackland Art Museum, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Addison Gallery of American Art, Phillips Academy, Andover, Massachusetts, Brooklyn Museum, Carmen Thyssen-Bornemisza Collection, Christie's, Collis Art LLC, New York, Currier Museum of Art, Manchester, New Hampshire, Dallas Museum of Art, Davidson Gallery, New York, the Dayton Art Institute, Ohio, Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, Frankel Gallery, San Francisco, Munson Williams Proctor Arts Institute, Utica, New York, Museo Nacional Thyssen-Bornemisza, Madrid, Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, the Museum of Modern Art, New York, Philadelphia Museum of Art, Smithsonian American Art Museum, Swope Art Museum, Terre Haute, Indiana, the University of Arizona Museum of Art, Tucson, Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, Wichita Art Museum, Kansas, as well as those who wish to remain anonymous. Partners, for their generous support of the exhibition, we would like to thank Bayer Stiftung, BNP Paribas Swiss Foundation, Luma Foundation, Terra Foundation for American Art. For their continued support, the Foundation Baylor cordially thanks Accurart, Bank J. Safra Saracen, Basler Catanal Bank, Bayer, Gaming Rehen, ISS Facility Services, Culture Basel-Stadt, La Prairie, Max Kohler Stiftung, Novartis, Rolls-Royce Motor Cars, UBS. And this is a picture of Hopper painting Lighthouse Hill at Two Lights, Cape Elizabeth in 1927. Contents, forward and acknowledgement, Edward Hopper to Charles H. Sawyer, Harold Hopper, a fresh look at landscape, the catalog, Edward Hopper in Cape Ann, another catalog, Hopper and Hitchcock, Landscapes of the Mind, third catalog, on Hopper's themes, Rocks, Lights, and Shadow, People and Landscape, ships and lighthouses, houses and landscape, traffic routes, the forest, and a short biography. And on 141 is a work of exhibited works. Actually didn't notice that person in the background until just now. Foreword and acknowledgements. Edward Hopper's Cape Ann Granite from 1928, formerly in the prestigious collection of David Rockefeller, is on permanent loan to our museum. The magnificent landscape painting provided the initial impetus for dedicating an exhibition to Hopper that focuses attention for the first time on his treatment of landscape, bringing together iconic oil paintings as well as a selection of his watercolors and drawings on this theme. The show is the first to present Hopper's work in German-speaking Switzerland. Hopper is one of the great known unknowns of modern art. Several of his works have attained astonishing popularity and belong to the cultural memory of the 20th century. Yet there are facets of his art that are only familiar to a small number of specialists. That means new and exciting discoveries can be made in his oeuvre among not only many of his paintings, but also watercolors and drawings that aren't direct preliminary works for his oil pictures. Our exhibition makes an important contribution to this discovery. According to art historical tradition, landscape signifies an image of nature as opposed to actual nature, which is constantly changing and as such cannot be captured in an image. Landscape always shows the influence of humankind on nature, something that Hopper's pictures subtly reflect in a variety of ways. He created a manifestly modern approach to one of art history's established genres. In contrast to the academic tradition, Hopper's landscapes appear limitless. They are theoretically infinite and seemingly always show only a small part of an enormous whole. Hopper's American landscapes are geometrically clear-cut compositions. Their main components are houses symbolizing human settlement. Railroads structure the pictures horizontally and stand for the human capacity to traverse the vastness of space. An enormous sky and particular lighting moods, the radiant midday sun and twilight, make the greatness of nature in its eternal state of transition tangible in a static painting. A lighthouse, for instance, becomes a point of reference in an expansive sea and coastline. Hopper's landscape paintings create the impression that they deal with something that cannot be seen, something that takes place outside the picture. This quality is evident in his 1950 painting Cape Cod Morning. The woman looking out through bay windows with the sun shining on her face sees something that the viewer cannot see because it is located beyond the picture space. Hopper's visible landscapes are forever confronted by invisible subjective landscapes that emerge within the viewer. Like in all his paintings, Hopper's landscapes are marked by melancholy and loneliness. They often convey a sense of uncanniness and danger. Hopper also makes humankind's sometimes brutal intrusion into nature visible by juxtaposing landscapes with cityscape. He contributed significantly to establishing the idea of a melancholic America, shaped also by the dark side of progress. As an immense boundless space, a notion that would become enormously popular, particularly through its development in movies, ranging from Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest to Wim Wenders' Paris, Texas, and Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves. It is a great fortune that Wim Wenders realized his own personal homage to Hopper. The 3D short film 2 or 3 Things I Know About Edward Hopper. On the occasion of our exhibition, Wenders' film will have its premiere at our exhibition opening poetically and touchingly. It demonstrates not only how much cinema owes to Hopper, but how much Hopper himself was influenced by cinema. When we presented our exhibition idea to our colleagues at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, where Hopper's artistic estate is preserved, they immediately offered their generous support. The Whitney Museum of American Art has made 41 works available for the show. We are grateful to the Board of Trustees for the magnificent loans as well as their advice and assistance. The art critic and modern American art specialist Jason E. Kaufman gave us valuable tips about Hopper in the early stage of planning the exhibition. The art dealer James L. Reinisch assisted us in our search for works by Hopper in private collections. And our consultant Sarah Fitzmaurice put her network of contacts at our disposal. Our thanks go to Erica Doss and David M. Lubin, as well as Katharina Ruppel, for their enlightening catalog text on Hopper's art. We are indebted to Richard Pandisio and William Locasino for their design of the catalog, supervised by Hatch Kunst Verlag, on whose behalf we name here Nicola von Velsen and Sven Fund. We likewise thank Jennifer Patton, Emily Zusbach, and Ethan Yaris from the Hopper House in Nyack, New York. We are grateful to the Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts for permission to publish Edward Hopper's famous letters to Charles H. Sawyer. We extend our gratitude to all of them, and last but not least, above all, to President of the Foundation Baylor, Hans-Georg Weiss, whose drive and imaginativeness are both exemplary and inspiring. Great thanks. It's a whole list of other thanks. The Foundation Baylor is able to realize its exhibition program first and foremost thanks to Baylor Stiftung and the Weiss Foundation. To the support of Canton of Basel-Stadt and the Municipality of Riehen, as well as to such sponsors and patrons such as BNP Paribas Swiss Foundation, the Luma Foundation, and the Terra Foundation for American Art. We hope our visitors and readers enjoy this exploration of Hopper's look at the American landscape. Sam Keller and Ulf Kuster. Edward Hopper to Charles H. Sawyer. 3 Washington Square, New York, October 19th, 1939. Mr. Charles H. Sawyer, Addison Gallery of American Art, Andover, Massachusetts. Dear Mr. Sawyer, you are asking me to do something which is perhaps as difficult to do as painting is, that is, to explain painting with words. To me, form, color, and design are merely a means to an end, the tools I work with, and they do not interest me greatly for their own sake. I am interested primarily in the vast field of experience and sensation, which neither literature nor purely plastic art deals with. One must say guardedly human experience for the fear of having it confounded with superficial anecdote. I am always repelled by painting that deals narrowly with harmonies or dissonances of color and design. My aim in painting is always using nature as the medium to try to project upon canvas my most intimate reaction to the subject, as it appears when I like it most. When the facts are given unity by my interest and prejudices, why I select certain subjects rather than others, I do not exactly know, unless it is that I believe them to be the best mediums for a synthesis of my inner experience. I spend many days, usually, before I find a subject that I like well enough to do, and spend a long time on the proportions of the canvas so that it will do for the design, as nearly as possible what I wish it to do. The very long horizontal shape of this picture at Hatton Bridge Loop is an effort to give a sensation of great lateral extent, carrying the main horizontal lines of the design with little interruption to the edges of the picture is to enforce this idea and to make one conscious of it. Of the spaces and elements beyond the limits of the scene itself. The consciousness of these spaces is always carried by the artist to the very limited space of the subject that he intends to paint. I believe all painters are not aware of this. The picture was planned very carefully in my mind before starting it, but except for a few small black and white sketches made from the fact I had no other concrete data, but relied on refreshing my memory by looking often at the subject. The preliminary sketches would do little for you in explaining the making of the picture. The color design and form have all been subjective, consciously or otherwise, to considerable simplification. So much of every art is expression of the subconscious that it seems to me most of all the important qualities are put there unconsciously and little importance by conscious intellect. But these are things for the psychologist to untangle. I hope that what I have written will be of use to you. Very sincerely, Edward Hopper. And on the right, we have been looking at Stairway, painted in 1949, oil on wood, courtesy of the Whitney Museum. American Landscape, 1920, etching. Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, gift of George Peabody Gardner. By Ulf Kuster, Edward Hopper, A Fresh Look at Landscape, on the exhibition at the Foundation Baylor. 1. I'm After Me. To mark the painter William de Kooning's 85th birthday in 1989, Art Journal published a short essay by the art historian and critic Irving Sandler. In it, Sandler recalls a conversation he had with de Kooning in 1959. At that time, probably the most famous living abstract expressionist artist. When asked about his then current large format non-representational gestural paintings, de Kooning cited two fellow artists as the sources he invoked in his work. The first was realist Gustave Courbet. De Kooning especially appreciated the fact that he was so concrete and overcome with reality. The memory of Courbet quickly brought de Kooning around to stating, "The mystery in the world is to see something that is really there." He continued, "I want to grab a piece of nature and make it as real as it actually is, like in my Merritt Parkway picture." Viewed objectively, the only thing that connects non-representational painting Merritt Parkway to the scenic four-lane landscape thoroughfare on which the affluent residents of Connecticut's so-called Gold Coast travel back to and forth to New York City is its title. He called it positively crazy to paint the Merritt Parkway a ribbon of gray and green in the fall when the colors change. He had this idea for years, and now it is real, de Kooning noted. He said the only artist he knew who could paint the Merritt Parkway as opposed to him, the European, the American, Edward Hopper. Why did he name Hopper of all people? What does this guardian of the figurative tradition in American painting, who spoke critically about non-representational art, have in common with one of the major exponents of abstract expressionism? Probably more than one might assume. At first glance, de Kooning was an acute observer of the contemporary art scene, and Hopper, whose portrait appeared on the cover of Time magazine's 1956 Christmas Eve issue, was already a living legend. In 1959, by that date, solo exhibitions to Hopper's oeuvre had long been shown not only at the Museum of Modern Art but also at the Whitney Museum of American Art. What de Kooning claimed for himself, and what he likewise admired about Courbet as well as Hopper, is the radical subjectivity that shaped their art. Hopper himself, an enthusiast of Courbet's work, regularly gave voice to this, such as in Notes on Painting. He published in the catalog to his 1933 retrospective exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. De Kooning was possibly familiar with the notes, which open with the sentence, "My aim in painting has always been the most exact transcription possible of my most intimate impressions of nature." In view of Hopper's understanding of art, the words "most intimate" should be underscored. Repeatedly asked about what his paintings were really about, the irritated artist finally answered, "I'm after me." Regardless of how recognizable and realistic, indeed even how naturalistic the respective painting is, it is always about Hopper's very personal view of things. It is about him. His subjectivity is by all means on a par with de Kooning, even if one is initially more inclined to accept it from the expressive gestural painter. Hopper's silence was famous. Recalcitrance was his method. Throughout his life, Hopper, who took German in school, carried around a piece of paper with a quotation from a letter by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe to Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi. Aside from indicating his profound knowledge of Goethe's works, it also documents his subjective approach to art described above. See, dear friend, what is the beginning and end of all writing? The reproduction of the world around me through the inner world in which everything is held, bound up, remade, kneaded, and peculiar form and manner again set forth, which remains eternally secret, God be thanked, and neither will I reveal it to gapers and chatterers. Hopper felt his work spoke for itself and did not require statements from the artist. The decision not to unlock the secret led to a kind of mystification of his oeuvre. Numerous interpretations ranging from utterly banal to philosophically complicated were made to seem possible. Hopper directly assigned a crucial role to the viewer, stating in an interview that the respective interpretation is solely dependent on the viewer. From his perspective, the self-centeredness of his art necessitated a self-centeredness on the part of his viewer. Hopper only rarely discussed his working method or supplied explanatory approaches. A 1939 letter to Charles H. Sawyer, the director of the Addison Gallery of American Art in Andover, Massachusetts, is especially revealing in this regard. In that, Hopper's statement from 1933 and the message of the Goethe quotation are repeated and clarified. It is probably the most important of all Hopper's personal testimonials. To begin, he positions his art between a narrative, anecdotal figuration, and abstraction as such. To me, form, color, and design are merely a means to an end, the tools I work with, and they do not interest me greatly for their own sake. I am interested primarily in the vast field of experience and sensation. One must say guardedly human experience for fear of having it confounded with superficial anecdote. I'm always repelled by painting. Oh, this is, we read this earlier in that letter, so I'm not going to reread that. At the end of his letter to Sawyer, Hopper references another one of his work's special features. His remark is perhaps the key to understanding why so many viewers are so fascinated by his paintings. So much of every art is an expression of the subconscious, that it seems to me most of all the important qualities are put there unconsciously, and little of importance by the conscious intellect, but these are things for psychologists to untangle. Hopper doubtlessly recognized and gave voice to the fact that the unconsciousness of art is confronted with the highly conscious process of painting. He addresses a fundamental problem, namely the difference between the inner image, which is to be the actual subject, and the technical difficulty involved in realizing it. His vision is subject to the decay inherently caused by the practical task of translation. Hopper's continuous fights against the decay of his ideas at the hands of their technical realization is probably the reason his artistic oeuvre is so limited. The catalogue raison of his oil paintings encompasses no more than 366 items. Even finding a subject was an extraordinarily difficult process for the painter, who would spend months, sometimes years, in search of a topic. The complexities involved in starting and his efforts to procrastinate culminated in countless visits to the theater or the movies, but above all, in intense phases of reading. Hopper was very well read, and his paintings often show people reading, those who find themselves in a world that is invisible for others. Observing people reading means becoming aware of the existence of imperceptible internal worlds. The extraordinary thing about Hopper's art is that while it makes dimensions of the invisible visible, it is left up to the viewer to explain the invisible for theirself. In his conversation with Sandler, de Kooning pointed out a further noteworthy aspect of Hopper's work. De Kooning drew a sketch of Hopper's 1950 painting Cape Cod Morning. For Sandler, we'll go ahead and oh, no, it just has the actual paper painting, not Kooning's sketch of it. Showing a house in which a woman looks out through a bay windows at something outside the picture frame and thus not visible to the viewer. The painting's background, a forest, impressed de Kooning. The forest looks real, like a forest, like you turn on it and there it is, like you turn and actually see it. De Kooning calls attention here to an exceptional phenomenon in Hopper's paintings, one that is difficult to define. It concerns the familiarity with the painted situations. The forest not only seems very real in Cape Cod Morning, as if it actually stood there, also in Hopper's famous painting Gas. I think that's this cover painting. Depicting a filling station, the forest in the background has a familiar presence that lends it an eerie impression because somehow we feel we know the place so very well. For Hopper, the forest was likewise a means with which he could point to inner worlds, as if the painting of a forest was intended to trigger our unconsciousness. Hopper loved poems about the forest, above all, Robert Frost Stopping in the Woods on a Snowy Evening from 1922, or Come In from 1942, and Ghost Wanderer's Nachtlied from 1776/80, which he frequently recited in his own translation. Ghost's poem in particular was important to him, and he described it as an extraordinary visual picture, doubtlessly meaning an internally visible picture. Hopper seems to have aspired to incorporating everything that means forest into his depictions, which appear as simple, as naturally present as Ghost or Frost poems. On the face of it, paintings painting simple pictures that are capable of opening up enormous inner worlds without specifically naming them is true of not only the forest in Hopper's oeuvre, but also his pictures of readers, which, as mentioned above, are to be seen in a similar light. Even the houses Hopper painted, the absolutely banal, run-of-the-mill wooden structures of the type found in small cities along the east coast of the United States, represent invisible worlds, such as those of the people residing in them. Hopper himself grew up in such a house in the village of Nyack, just to the north of New York City. His houses are haunted houses, but it is uncertain whether they are inhabited by friendly or evil demons. Variations of Hopper's birthplace with its distinctive veranda, as well as other Nyack houses, appear in many of his paintings and can be also characterized as self-portraits, as it were. While the veranda is sited in Summer Evening, in Lee Shore, another house in the direct vicinity of the Hopper family home is summarily shifted to an imaginary Cape Cod-inspired coast. In the 1949 painting Stairway, he combined the view down the stairs from the second floor of his parents' home with one of his dark forests, making it seem as if it were possible to access the forest of the eerily unconscious straight from his childhood home. 2. American Landscape. Looking at Hopper's work as a whole, it becomes evident that the paintings for which he became world famous were produced relatively late in his career. The earliest of the typical Hopper images were painted in the early 1920s, when the artist was already around 40 years old. They build on a rich store of experience. Hopper worked for many years until around 1925 as a commercial illustrator. While he always felt this to be a burden, it enabled him to make a living. He also learned how, through concentrated artistic effort, to attain an unambiguous effect and to create the familiar situations mentioned above, particularly illustrations concerning negotiation and sales techniques, that he drew at irregular intervals between 1912 and 1915 for System, the magazine of business, reveal his talent for evoking a convincing atmosphere with an economy of means, the simplicity of which recalls the corporate behavior of the protagonists of AMC's Mad Men. Hopper's beginnings as a painter were likewise shaped by an endeavor to achieve a concentration of artistic means. In the oil studies he made during his 3 trips to Europe between 1906 and 1910, where he spent most of his time in Paris, and shortly thereafter Hopper experimented with unconventional views and a flattish style of painting oriented on Albert Marquet and Philippe Vallotton, artists whose works he surely saw while in Paris. In 1915, he started to develop his typical Hopper mood, the melancholic atmosphere of loneliness and isolation that would become characteristic of many of his later paintings. In his etchings, by invoking a kind of synthesis of the experiences he had made in advertising and in oil painting, Hopper himself was aware that his more mature painting style built on his work as a printmaker, remarking, "After I took up etching, my paintings seemed to crystallize." Hopper laid out a supply of themes in his etchings that he would take up again and develop further in his large format paintings. In them, we encounter, for the first time, not only the nocturnal metropolis, but also the interaction between exterior and interior space. The construction of tension and the representation of solitary houses, trains, and sailboats, the contemplative and complicated technical procedure of etching and printing probably led to the concentration that would become equally characteristics of his etchings and later paintings. Evident here is an interesting parallel to the art of our times. The painter Peter Doig likewise initially tested many of his pictorial worlds in prints. Yet while this is an ongoing process for Doig, Hopper stopped making prints relatively early in his career, 1928. The 1920 etching American Landscape, which we saw on the previous page, is one of the works that influenced Hopper's later pictorial inventions. It stood out at the outset of the considerations for the exhibition at the Foundation Baylor, which is accompanied by this text and catalog. As far as the title is concerned, the fact that Hopper wanted to represent a decidedly American landscape is probably the result of an interest in the establishment of a national aesthetic that he shared with many of his contemporaries after World War I. What is more, thanks to his travels in Europe, he was familiar enough with European landscape that he was also aware of how it differed from American landscape. In his oil sketch of the Seine Valley, 1909, in which Montmartre is recognizable in the background, we look out from an elevated position at the compartmentalized structure of European landscape. The manner in which it is shaped by transport, visualized here based on the railroad viaduct and the many settlements. The etching American Landscape, on the other hand, shows relatively little land, presenting the scene from a worm's eye view. In truth, only a bright, expansive sky is visible, which contrasts the seemingly impenetrable forest in the background below. Well, I'm gonna take a look because I did not even think of that as a forest. I guess they're right. Yeah, well, I mean, it's not so much as a forest as much as it is a line of windbreak. A multi-story house with a gable viewed from the ground below. Multi-story house with a gable viewed from the side stands in front of the forest. The view of the ground floor is obstructed by a dam running across the foreground, probably a railroad embankment. Lank cows cross it in the direction of the forest. The picture's composition is defined by parallel horizons that extend beyond the picture's edges on the left and right, lending the print an impression of vastness. In this work, Hopper conveys the cliché of America as a country with seemingly limitless, wide open space, shaped by railroad and cows, belonging to the settlers who build their peculiar homes, which in turn represent further developments and specific interpretations of run-of-the-mill European architecture. Hopper's American landscape etching is, however, not only the description of a natural space, but also an art theoretical statement. This painting is Hotel Lobby, painted in 1943. It is oil on canvas, and it is housed in the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields. In the academically shaped tradition of European painting, it's like some anatomical drawings from his school days. Landscape was an artistic genre that followed specific rules. The viewer's gaze was to be guided into the distant past via staggered groups of hills or mountain ranges. The view was to be bookended on the left and right by groups of trees or rock formations. A genre scene, perhaps peasants working in their fields, often religious or mythological episodes placed mainly in the foreground, was intended to influence and comment on the mood of the picture. All of this is founded on the idea formulated above in the 18th century. That while nature is constantly changing and cannot be represented, the landscape is an ideal, albeit static, image of nature. With the Hudson River School, a style of landscape painting tailored to the special aspects of the enormous country, developed in the U.S. 19th century that was based on European academic tradition. The sublime panoramic landscapes by Albert Bierstadt, for example, followed the design principles of academic painting. Hopper knew these works well in his 1943 painting Hotel Lobby that we just saw. He depicted a typical example of monumental American landscape. Painting hanging on the wall, Hopper's American landscape is the exact opposite of the works of the Hudson River School. Nothing is static. The viewer's gaze is not directed. Quite the contrary, the viewer must first orient themselves. The selected view seems to be randomly chosen and part of a much larger whole. This lends Hopper's etching a mental dynamic that questions the concept of the traditional landscape. The expanse of the sky is limitless. The dark forest continues just as endlessly as the train tracks cutting through the image. The dynamic is heightened further by the contrast between the immobile house and the cows lumbering by. Hopper's landscapes are open, both compositionally and mentally. In the letter to Charles H. Sawyer, Hopper wrote in detail about the limitlessness of his pictures. He specifically references the 1928 painting Manhattan Bridge Loop, but his description is also applicable to other works such as American Landscape. The design principle Hopper described in his letter to Sawyer is evident in the pictures he made of the houses and the seemingly endless expanse of land on Cape Cod to the south of Boston. Edward and his wife Jo spent their summers on Cape Cod as of 1934, living in a Spartan self-designed wood house with a large studio window and a view of the bay. Hopper was perhaps aware that Cape Cod is a coastal spit, a constantly changing and growing dune built by wind and the flow of water. The Hoppers were thus living in a place where the dynamics of nature were particularly palpable. Seen this way, his paintings of Cape Cod are indeed landscapes in the traditional sense, to the extent that they can serve a view of nature that itself could have changed in the very next moment. Of all of Hopper's works that can be characterized as landscapes in the broadest sense of the term, his 1928 painting, Cape Ann Granite, which shows a view of Granite Coast at Gloucester, Massachusetts as seen from land, represents a special case. It is not a snapshot of nature, that is to say, a landscape in the art theoretical sense. This coastal landscape reveals the intervening hand of humankind. Here granite was quarried and made into the paving stones that the early settlers used to develop and order the land. And yet the dynamics of nature seem to be especially evident in this painting, namely through the use of light and the almost overemphasized shadows. In an interview by Brian Doherty, Hopper once said that he was almost solely interested in the illustration of sunlight. It did not mean the sun's rays themselves, but rather the things that are illuminated by light and thus made perceptible. Hopper was already interested in the exposure to light as a youth, albeit not in the sense of photography. As a sectional drawing of a human eye in one of his school notebooks demonstrates, he seemed to have been preoccupied with optical perception from early on. Sunshine often takes the form of sunspots in Hopper's paintings or is visualized as shade, the opposite of light. Sunshine is an entity that affects the painting from the outside, can supposedly only be apprehended by the eye in the form of illumination, and at the same time its presence can also be felt. Here Hopper seems to have found a method making not just landscape tangible, but nature as a principle of constant change as well. We will be ending here for today. As you can see, it does get a lot less text heavy as we go on, which why I wanted to bring this to make a nice contrast on why I was disappointed with that other book. We will continue on section 3 with notes on the exhibition, and that will be tomorrow.